For decades, people with blood sugar problems have been given one simple instruction. Stop eating carbs. It sounds clean. It sounds scientific. But in real life, it quietly falls apart. Because we're not talking about exotic foods. We're talking about foods people eat every single day. Rice that sits at the center of the table. Bread that starts the morning. Potatoes, yams, corn, cassava, pasta. Foods that aren't just meals, but memories. These are foods people grew up with. Foods their parents cooked. Foods tied to culture, celebration, comfort, and survival. So when someone is told, just cut carbs, what they're really being told is, walk away from the foods that shaped your life. And for most people, that's not discipline failure. That's an identity conflict. That's why most restrictive plans don't fail in the first week, but months later. They fail when life gets busy. They fail when stress hits. They fail when food becomes emotional again. And here's the truth no one explains clearly enough. It's not that carbohydrates are impossible to eat safely. It's that most people were never taught how. Once you understand how carbohydrates behave in the body, not in theory, but in real digestion, they stop being mysterious. They stop being scary. They become predictable. And predictable foods are manageable foods. Today, we're going to walk through how to eat carbohydrates in a way that respects real life, protects your blood sugar, and improves insulin resistance, without asking you to abandon your culture or your plate. Quick disclaimer before we continue. This is educational information, not personal medical advice. If you have diabetes or take medications that affect blood sugar, speak with your healthcare provider before making changes. Now let's start at the foundation. Because once this clicks, everything else makes sense. When you eat carbohydrates, your body turns most of them into glucose. That's normal. That's biology. The problem isn't glucose. The problem is speed. When glucose enters your bloodstream too fast, blood sugar spikes. When spikes happen often, insulin has to work overtime. When insulin works overtime for too long, cells stop listening. That's insulin resistance. So the real question isn't, are carbs bad? The real question is, how fast do they turn into sugar in your body? This is where most advice stops being helpful, and where we need to slow things down and explain properly. Not all starch behaves the same way. Some starch breaks down quickly, some starch breaks down slowly, and some starch resists digestion almost entirely. That last type is called resistant starch, and the name matters because it does exactly what it sounds like. It resists digestion. Instead of turning into glucose right away, resistant starch passes through the small intestine and reaches the large intestine. There, gut bacteria ferment it. That fermentation produces compounds that improve insulin sensitivity, reduce inflammation, strengthen the gut lining. So instead of raising blood sugar sharply, resistant starch actually helps regulate it. Now here's where this becomes practical and empowering. You don't need exotic foods to get resistant starch. You can turn regular starches into resistant starch just by changing temperature. When foods like rice, pasta, or potatoes are cooked, then cooled, part of the starch reorganizes into a structure your digestive enzymes struggle to break down. This process, called starch retrogradation, happens naturally. When you reheat the food later, much of that resistant starch remains. In simple terms, starchy foods like rice, potatoes, pasta, or bread are cooked and then cooled. Part of their starch changes structure. It reorganizes into a form your enzymes struggle to digest. Even when you reheat that food later, much of that resistant starch remains. So yesterday's rice doesn't act like today's rice. Cooled potatoes don't behave like freshly boiled ones. Same food, same calories, different metabolic response. This matters because it means you're not fighting your body. You're working with it. And this isn't just theory. Multiple studies show that cooled and reheated starches produce lower post-meal glucose and insulin spikes than freshly cooked versions. Now pause here because this is important. You didn't remove the food. You didn't replace the food. You didn't give up anything. You simply changed how the food enters your body. So, instead of eliminating rice or potatoes, cook them ahead of time. Let them cool in the fridge. Reheat them when you're ready. The taste stays familiar, but the metabolic impact changes in your favor. And that pattern, changing the rules instead of removing the player, is the theme of everything that follows. Let's move to the next principle. Carbohydrates almost never travel alone. In real meals, carbs are eaten with other foods. And those other foods change everything. Protein slows digestion. Fat delays how fast food leaves the stomach. Fiber slows glucose absorption. When carbs are eaten by themselves, glucose enters the bloodstream fast. When carbs are paired properly, glucose enters slowly. This is why rice eaten alone behaves very differently from rice eaten with beans, vegetables, oil, or fish. It's not magic. It's timing and digestion. This is why cultures that eat carb-heavy diets often do better metabolically than expected. They rarely eat carbs naked. Potatoes with nothing spike faster than potatoes with butter or vegetables. And this is why avoiding naked carbs is one of the simplest, most effective strategies you can apply immediately. Now let's repeat this idea, because repetition builds understanding. Carbs aren't dangerous on their own. They become dangerous when they're isolated, refined, and rushed into the bloodstream. Another powerful modifier is acid. Vinegar, lemon juice, fermented foods. These slow starch breakdown and improve how muscles handle glucose. Even small amounts can noticeably flatten post-meal spikes. Change the company they keep, and you change the outcome. Now here's another concept that sounds small, but produces large effects. The order in which you eat food matters. If you start a meal with sugar or starch, glucose rises quickly. If you start with vegetables and protein, digestion slows. Same plate, same calories, different blood sugar curve. Clinical studies consistently show that eating protein and vegetables before carbohydrates leads to significantly lower glucose and insulin spikes, even in people with type 2 diabetes. This matters in restaurants, at family gatherings, and in daily life. It's especially useful in restaurants, where bread arrives before the main course. Flip the script. Eat the salad and protein first. Save the carbs for last. You don't need willpower. You need sequence. Next, let's talk about what happens after the meal. Because digestion doesn't end at the table. Movement after eating acts like a pressure valve for blood sugar. You don't need a workout. You don't need sweat. You don't need intensity. A short walk, 10 minutes, is enough. Light movement activates muscles that pull glucose out of the bloodstream without relying heavily on insulin. One reason walking works so well is a muscle in the calf called the soleus. It's built for endurance and burns glucose efficiently for long periods. Gentle movement activates it perfectly. It works slowly, steadily, and for long periods, exactly what you want after a meal. Again, notice the pattern. No restriction, no elimination. Just small behavioral shifts that compound. Now let's clear up one more misunderstanding, perhaps the biggest of them all, that keeps people stuck. The issue isn't carbs, it's processing. Finely milled foods digest fast. Whole foods digest slow. White bread, pastries, instant cereals, chips. These behave like fuel dumped onto a fire. Quick burn, big spike, fast crash. Whole grains, beans, intact oats, vegetables, these burn like logs. Slower, steadier, predictable. Fibre is the difference maker here. Removing fibre often worsens insulin resistance over time. And finally, timing matters more than most people realize. As the day goes on, your body becomes less efficient at processing glucose. Late-night meals, especially heavy ones, produce higher blood sugar responses, even if the food itself isn't high in carbs. Earlier dinners consistently produce better glucose control. Hormones involved in sleep reduce insulin secretion at night. That's why earlier dinners consistently lead to better glucose control. A simple guideline: finish your last meal at least 3 hours before bedtime whenever possible. So if you step back and look at the whole picture, the message becomes clear. You don't fix blood sugar by declaring war on carbohydrates. You fix it by understanding how they behave, when they enter, and what they're paired with. Preparation, pairing, order, movement, processing, timing. This is how you eat carbohydrates without letting them control you. And once you understand this, food stops being the enemy and becomes a tool again. If this helped clarify things, let me know comments. And consider subscribing to our channel. It matters to us. Knowledge is power, but action is transformative. Start with one simple swap today, and imagine the ripple effect it can have over years.